Alright, folks, it's that time again for another SEPreme reading. Lots of news about peace today in the last couple of days, and I'm still processing all of it, as I'm sure all of you are, those of you who process the news. And it's always pretty grounding to pair a bit of more so timeless theory with current events, and that'll be a continuing theme of the readings that we'll do here, because there's a lot of articles in the SEP which will be read, well, those which shed some light on topics already being discussed by, let's call you all lay people, no offense, but you haven't wasted as much of your life reading this encyclopedia as I have, so you can benefit from the time that I put in. This is Section 5, Religious and Cultural Basis for Pacifism. Very topical, right? Let's share the screen here. And let's read, because reading is a virtue. Speaking of virtue ethics. So, Section 5, Religious and Cultural Basis for Pacifism. 5.1, Religion and Virtue Ethics. Pacifism that is absolutist and deontological is often grounded in religious belief. But the reverse doesn't have to be true. If you're anti-religious, you'll affirm the consequent there, right? And run the arrow in the other direction. You wouldn't do that, though. You wouldn't affirm the consequent, would you? I certainly wouldn't. Christian philosopher Stanley Hauerwas has explained that pacifism is a theological position because it can be a theological position because it is as much about eschatological faith as it is about ethics and politics. Well, what it's about depends on that person's pacifism. That's a bit imperious, I think. Anyway, a variety of religions have supported pacifist positions, yes. Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists share a concern for ahisma or nonviolence as a basic moral virtue. Yeah, the other day I asked ChatGPT to rank religions from most to least pacifist, and these were pretty high up there, but for Hinduism it specified that it was like the ahisma versions. So Hindus out there, let me know, are you down with ahisma, or are you like a violent Hindu? Likewise, Christians also find a commitment to nonviolence at the heart of their tradition. Well, this we understand, we in the Judeo-Christian echo chamber, that Nietzsche called Christendom, right? One reason that absolutist and deontological pacifism appears to require a religious foundation is that the commitment to peace can lead to suffering in the quote-unquote real world of political life. But for some religious believers, the world of political life is only an apparent world and not the real world at all. In the Buddhist tradition, the world of dependent arising is a world of appearances in which suffering is ubiquitous. Some pairing there between suffering and universal sin. One of the ways to, the Buddhist doctrine that life is suffering does strike me as similar to the Christian doctrine of original sin, right? Universal suffering, universal original sin. Sin is definitely connected to suffering, right? If there was no suffering connected to sin, it probably wouldn't be a sin. Suffering is not just pain, right? It's meaningless pain, unnecessary pain, uninformative pain, or pleasure, as Brave New World taught us, that meaningless pleasure is also suffering. So don't suffer the meaningless pleasure of hedonism either. One of the ways to overcome this suffering is to see through the veil of Maya and the illusions of this world. Ahisma, or nonviolence, is a virtue that renounces the ubiquitous violence of the real world, quote-unquote real. In a different way, the Christian tradition holds that the quote-unquote city of God, or divine providence, is a mysterious reality that is infinitely more important than the reality of the quote-unquote city of man. Well, that's a very metaphysical take. The structure of this sort of religious belief is closely related to the absolute, deontological, and transformational nature of religious pacifism. In Christian pacifism, it is God's commandments, as articulated by Jesus, that necessitate a commitment to pacifism. Of course, this is a contentious point, and some deny that Christianity requires pacifism. Oh dear. Not me. Christian pacifists maintain that Christians should refuse to kill regardless of the consequences in the quote-unquote real world. That would sound like absolutists, but related to this is the faith that God will provide both the strength to endure suffering and a final reward for those who remain committed to principles of nonviolence. Well, that may be after Paul killed James. Watch this amazing YouTube channel called Spinoza Forever. They make Spinoza very watchable. Difficult philosopher, right? But Spinoza Forever, you can just take it in like candy. Probably a few wrong things in there, But they go for the claims are not so wrong that they're not bad starting points. There's arguments for what they're saying, and there's one about Spinoza's take that he thinks that Paul killed James to seize control of the church. And it struck me that this is related to the recent conflation, between universal love and conditional forgiveness. Erica Kirk just forgave the shooter, but the shooter didn't repent. So how are you going to fix a bug if no one even says what line the bug is on, what the code should be instead, what the moral code should be instead, or computer code, however you think of it? So to me, forgiveness is like fixing a bug. Not this stuff like, you just released yourself from where. Like, no, either the bug is fixed or it's not. And forgiving without repentance is like saying a bug is fixed when the bug is not fixed. So it's actually a lie. So I don't support unconditional forgiveness. I support unconditional love. But part of love is forgiving people meaningfully, not arbitrarily. That's actually disrespectful to forgive someone arbitrarily, not even caring whether they fix their own bugs, right? Anyway, what sentence are we on here? Yes. Even though pacifism may seem imprudent or even idiotic from the standpoint of consequentialism or political realism, these consequences have no lasting significance from the standpoint of providence. That's dangerous. So, so the Paul James thing, they're saying that, basically James was suggesting more of a revealed religion and Paul more of an institutionalized religion. You'll hear it better explained by Spinoza Forever, but maybe we'll do a piece on that. Indeed, religious pacifists are not averse to the pain that they might suffer as a result of their refusal to take part in violence because they believe that this suffering will be redeemed in the larger structure of divine justice. Checks in the mail is how I used to satirize it as a teenage atheist, but I'm a polytheist now. I'm open to all ideas. Still an atheist, but I'm also a polytheist now. A further variety of religious pacifism is closely connected with the ideas of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics emphasizes the cultivation of virtues over the course of a lifetime. Virtue ethicists are reluctant to judge actions in isolation from the total context of an individual's life. Religious pacifism has a virtue ethics component when the commitment to peace is conceived as a lifelong project of personal transformation. In the Christian tradition, this is understood as a project in which human beings learn to imitate Jesus in order to become closer to God, not to be confused with the Nine Inch Nails song, which is excellent. The Christian model of virtue is Jesus, and Jesus' practice of nonviolence culminated in his crucifixion. Christian martyrs have looked to this paradigm for millennia. However, it is important to note that virtue ethics need not be reduced to a merely religious idea. There are important non-religious articulations of virtue ethics. Thank God, pardon the pun. And there are authors who defend versions of pacifism based on claims grounded in humanistic virtue ethics. David K. Chan has argued, for example, that while virtuous individuals would generally be averse to killing, they would not be absolute pacifists. A different argument for pacifism based in virtue ethics has been made by Trevigno, 2013, who argues that training soldiers to kill turns them into bad persons. Well, certainly can do, yeah. A similar, and maybe that's the default assumption, burden of proof from the anarchist perspective is on those who are training soldiers to kill to prove that they're not turning them into bad persons. By default, we should assume that training someone to kill is making them a bad person and prove why our military training is somehow some kind of exception, and it frequently is not. Same with the cops. A similar idea about the practical impact of violence or non-violence is found in the Indian traditions. Gandhi's practice of self-renunciation, brahmacharya, my apologies. This is like Donald Trump trying to say acetaminophen. Brahmacharya, including his vow of poverty, and his fasts were closely tied to his commitment to ahimsa. For Gandhi, nonviolence is part of a total practice of virtue. In the Buddhist tradition, this is devoted, for example, in Thich Nhat Hanh's 1987 idea of being peace, unquote. You've probably heard of that in popular culture, being peace, Thich Nhat Hanh. The virtue approach emphasizes that pacifism is a lifelong project that requires discipline and practice. This is true because we are not born virtuous. I posted once something that began with all babies are evil, like born evil. It got people very angry, but none of their arguments made any impact on what was established. Look it up, Babies Are Evil, Adam Golding on Facebook. This is true because we are not born virtuous. Rather, we learn to cultivate the virtue of peacefulness by gradually learning habits that help us to control and resist anger, hatred, pride, competitiveness, and the other emotions that lead to violence. And by the way, in Pali traditions, it's more about naming the positive emotion compersion that's missing from this equation. It's very, like labeling emotions gives you way more agency over them, but if you only label the negative ones you're inhibiting, that's only half of the equation. It's like an upper bound without a lower bound. You can also name the positive emotion you want to cultivate, compersion. And people who don't know the word for it are likely to cultivate it less because you can't label it and say, oh, that was compersion. I wonder what produced the compersion. I should try to feel compersion more, because you're supposed to be happy for other people when something good happens to them and sad for them when something bad happens to them. I'm not really aware of any good exception to that. Even in the utmost military conflict, there should be no pleasure taken in defeating the enemy. It should be, every military victory is a Pyrrhic victory, is what I'm trying to say. Here they're about to talk about original sin. So, yes, emotional habits, very key. We have a modern notion of kind of like emotional, I don't want to say unhingedness, because that's actually key to artistic expression sometimes. Emotional, explosive emotional validity, where all feelings are equally valid and no one can be, emoting in an unfair way. But where does unfairness come from if it's detached from emotion? All emotions are fair. Like, give me a break. But it's part of how people, especially women, are oppressed by being infantilized. This idea that like, my emotions are uncontrollable. Well, emotional self-regulation is the only road out of any kind of oppression, really. So any norm that says, it's bad to have emotional self-regulation is actually oppressing you, ladies and boys. And look up the difference. Emotional social interregulation, intra-regulation, there's co-regulation, all that stuff. It really throws a wrench at some of the individuals, like, it's not just like individuals have to regulate themselves, it's that we all need to be aware of emotional regulation collectively. And actually, Spinoza Forever says that about Jesus in their video about how Jesus might have been a secret Buddhist. They just say that he is. It's a very bold-faced channel. There's a older documentary that says, was Jesus a secret Buddhist? Or more recently, has been posted about for a while, a more recent thing from Bart Ehrman about whether Jesus was an Essene. So which was it? Was he an Essene? Was he a Buddhist? I mean, I guess he could be both, because he traveled for those 10 years when he went missing. But basically, he seems to have brought something from the East back to the West. And as I was saying in I Disavowed the Da Vinci Code, I don't think he made it to Ireland. I think he went east. There's these stories about, Jesus made it to Ireland, and therefore Ireland's really Christian and not at all pagan and full of leprechauns. They confused the leprechauns with the lepers that Jesus was healing. But Jesus did not heal a leprechaun. Okay, and not that there's anything wrong with that, with being a leprechaun. Okay, a bit off topic, but it's Friday night, so I'm sure you're ready for it. In the Christian tradition, this is linked to the idea of original sin. We are born in violence and have to learn to overcome violence. I'm not sure how many people would agree that the original sin is necessarily a sin of violence. That's definitely I don't want to say a leap of logic. There might be an implicit premise here, but it's a step of logic. Theological questions arise in Christianity about whether human beings can overcome violence by themselves, or whether grace is needed in order to cultivate the virtue of peace. It is possible to develop a version of virtue pacifism from a non-religious standpoint. In the ancient world, some versions of Stoicism and Epicureanism come close to this. Stoics, for example, emphasize the virtue of tranquility or undisturbedness. You have to be a bit undisturbed to get through the entire word. Someone will push you over a few syllables in. Undisturbedness. One attains this state by learning proper discipline and by cultivating the other virtues that are essential for reigning in hubris. Hubris is wanton violence or pride run amok. I mean, that's a pretty simplistic definition of hubris, but I had a much richer lesson on that in high school English. But hubris is more like Kid Icarus. Icarus, yes? He had the hubris to fly close to the sun. It wasn't really just pride, it's overconfidence. He could have felt shame about it. It's actually overconfidence, closer to what I was saying today about war and stimulants. They introduce false confidence. Look up what I told some kid about the War Machine on Substack. Since Plato, the Greek tradition has claimed that justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom were needed to overcome hubris. It is conceivable that these virtues would conjoin in a sort of peacefulness. Yeah, take a look at the flow chart I made, what world peace requires, and you can see how world peace includes confrontation, namely nonviolent confrontation. You have to increase the amount of nonviolent confrontation to decrease the amount of violent confrontation, because there is a conservation of confrontation. Otherwise, like the hydraulic theory of mind, it builds up and it boils over. And this is even true in studies of couples who wait a long time to fight, don't stay together as long as couples who fight right away. As soon as something comes up, they address it and just deal with it. And that requires radical honesty and all that. Okay, so it was, as they said, it is conceivable that these virtues would conjoin in a sort of peacefulness. Indeed, one can see the roots of nonviolent social protest in Socrates' non-resistance to the Athenian state. I mean, his students defected to the opposing military, but we'll leave it out, I guess. It should be noted, however, that although Socrates refused to carry out unjust orders, he did serve the state in battle. That is true. Sorry, this is the standard truth of history. A non-religious version of virtue pacific and the ideas of 20th century humanists, such as William James. At the beginning of the 20th century, James acknowledged that war and military service did produce certain virtues, such as courage and discipline. But war on what? Does it have to be a violent war for that? See, that's kind of science support. What if it's just a cyber war? I mean, I know that's not really pacifism, but if we're talking about physical violence, at least, like, you can have courage in the mental realm. You can have discipline in the mental realm, in the battlefield of ideas. But James hoped that there could be a non-military way of producing these virtues. Yes, he hoped that. But this was the basic idea behind his proposal for a, quote, moral equivalent to war, unquote. Yes, sign me up. Which was an attempt to find a way to produce virtues without connecting them to militarism. Good work, James, 1910, William James. Okay, 5.2, we'll just keep going here and do section 5 all in one. 5.2, diverse religious and cultural sources. The general rejection of war has a long history that parallels the just war tradition, and its idea that wars should be fought for the sake of peace and justice. In the West, pacifism and the just war tradition have roots in both Christian and non-Christian sources. For Christian thinkers, one of the primary problems is trying to reconcile the pacific commandments of Jesus with the apparent moral necessity of using war to defend the innocent. Yeah, tell me about it. Sometimes being nice is being mean to someone else, as I like to say, like if the judge is too nice to your abuser. This problem is acute for Christians since Jesus seems to advocate an ethic of nonviolence, both in the Sermon on the Mount and in his submission to violence. While Augustine and others use both biblical sources, such as Paul's letter to the Romans, well, watch out for Paul there, might kill your brother, and natural law to argue in favor of the just war idea. In the European tradition, pacifism is an ideal that develops alongside of and in contrast to the just war tradition. With adherents of pacifism, including the Mennonites and Quakers, as well as Christian humanists such as Erasmus, who makes a cameo in a classic video game, Quest for Glory. Originally named Heroes Quest, before they had a intellectual property lawsuit from the board game, which I also played. The problem of justifying war is also found in Greek thinkers such as Plato, who argued in the Laws that war should only be waged for the sake of peace, and that, quote, It is peace in which each of us should spend most of his life and spend it best, unquote. And in the Credo, Socrates considers the problem of whether it is ever justified to return evil for evil. Well, no, it's not. Socrates begins with the assumption that we must do no harm. And he and Credo agree at one point that one, quote, ought not retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him, unquote. I agree. It seems that this idea is behind Socrates' decision to remain in prison and allow himself to be executed. That is a step further that I'm going to have to think about, because I don't think it would be easy for Socrates to escape from prison, or maybe by default breaking any law is evil. That would be more like Plato than Socrates, I think, but I'll get back to you on that. Pacifism shows up in non-European traditions as well. Jains, Buddhists, and others in the Indian tradition share a commitment to ahisma, or nonviolence, as a cardinal virtue. The ideal in these traditions is a sort of selflessness in which, through the dissolution of the self, a larger truth emerges. For Buddhists, this is based upon the idea of non-attachment. War, violence, anger, and hatred result from our attachment to material things. Well, you also can look up Zizek's talk at Google, where he talks about a book, Buddhism and War, not his book, and he talks about how the Buddhist doctrine that there is no self actually enabled war because they could dissociate from themselves while committing murder on the battlefield. I know John Mearshare was going to say that's not murder. Anyway, killing, whatever. Ahisma, so I'm not sure how pacifist Buddhism really is. That might be the part of Buddhism that was taken to the West, right? Ahisma, it's not like they don't, like Buddhist countries never go to war. Like, come on. Even the claim that democracies rarely go to war with one another is a bit suspect. Like, is that due to the essence of democracy? Some kind of accident? That could just be a coalition of democracies trying to prove their point. Like, okay, in order to prove democracy, let's all not go to war with one another. Ahisma is also linked to the idea that all sentient beings are interdependent, and so they are. Thus, nonviolence is extended toward a rejection of violence towards sentient beings in general, and a commitment to vegetarianism. I was vegetarian once. Mohandas Gandhi is perhaps the most famous adherent of ahisma in the last century. Gandhi based his commitment to nonviolence on a spiritual foundation that emphasized self-renunciation, brahmacharya, that word again, brahmacharya, and that sounds much better, and the positive action of the force of love or force of truth that he called satyagraha. That I've heard of. While Indian traditions are often cited as sources of pacifism, it is also important to note that pacifism and nonviolence can be found in Islamic traditions and in African religious and philosophical traditions. Yeah, I've been trying to look into that, of where the pacifist Islam really is and how it can be amplified, because I'm not hearing a lot of it lately, right? Obviously, a lot of that is propaganda. I won't say the Z word, but it's propaganda that is anti-Muslim for sure, and doesn't mean that Hamas's charter isn't devoted to exterminating Jews in Israel, but that doesn't prove logically that there's no such thing as pacifist Islam. I will say that it's possible that ChatGPT itself is Islamophobic, because when I created the framework Anarcho-Christian Atheist Polytheism with the 4 theses, anarchism, might is right, Christianity, Christ is good, atheism, no God is real, and pacifism, all gods are equally, polytheism, all gods are equally real. I then asked it to sort religions according to these 4 criteria. You can look at the table it generated, and it basically said that Islam disagrees with most of that. It disagrees with anarchism and disagrees with... Now, obviously, that's monolithic, so that's why I'm saying this is very easily a straw man of Islam, in that there's some pacifist Islam that needs to be strengthened so that non-pacifist Islam is weakened. This seems to be something that Christianity had to deal with earlier, right? And arguably is still dealing with, of course. It's not like Christian nations aren't warlike. But you can say that's a no true Scotsman thing and actually not be doing a fallacy. You can say that's not what Jesus would really have done. It's not like what would a true Scotsman have done. It's what would Jesus have done. Although you might ask what a true Scotsman would have done as well. Ramin Jahan Beglu argues that, for example, that Islam, whose root is salam, which means peace, includes a rich conversation about violence and peace. conversation, it's not a conclusion. In the South Asian context of the 20th century, Muslims such as Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad and Khan Abdul Jafar Khan joined Gandhi in affirming the power of nonviolence. There has been discussion among some Western politicians and journalists in the past couple of decades about whether there is something inherently violent about Islam, here we go, and its notion of jihad. This is exactly what I was referencing. But scholars such as Cole and Shadi show that the diverse Muslim tradition includes a number of pacifist thinkers. Well, okay, they didn't completely outlaw pacifist thinkers. And Alvi explains that a notion of non-violent jihad can be found in Islam in relation to the idea of jihad as spiritual struggle and with regard to the role of non-violent activism in Islamic context. Well, whether it's widespread in the religion or not, I certainly support non-violent jihad compared to violent jihad. Because, taking hostages is a war crime, and I would say no just war can use rape as a tool of war, thus Hamas's war was not a just war. Unfortunately for the Palestinian people who could have used a more just government to represent their interests. A similar kind of diversity can be found across the world's traditions. This includes pacifist ideas found in a variety of indigenous traditions, and often this involves a kind of syncretism that results from colonialism. Wah, wah. Not syncretism like, let's all get along, let's conquer each other, which god won? Okay, now we have a new religion. One example in North America is worth noting, the case of Papunhong, a Native American convert to Quaker religion in Pennsylvania during colonial times, who has been cited as a quote-unquote pacifist prophet. In Africa, full stop. In Africa, through this syncretism, in African thought, this syncretism also influences the I butchered this sentence. In African thought, this syncretism also includes the influence of Christianity and Islam. Of course, through Coptic Christianity in Africa, original Christianity pretty much, other than the ones who were killed because they were following James after Paul killed James. For example, the Jakanki pacifists of West Africa were an Islamic sect, and it is important to note that Gandhi was also at work in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu are now seen as important figures in the history of nonviolence. While Tutu works in the Christian tradition, we also see an emphasis on nonviolence in indigenous African contexts. Gail Presby has traced out numerous examples of this, including the way that nonviolence is related to concepts such as Ubuntu, not to confuse with the Linux distro. It is to note that the distinction between European and non-European traditions breaks down in the 20th century. Gandhi was inspired by Thoreau and by Tolstoy, and Gandhi in turn inspired Western pacifists such as Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhi and King both claim that one of the most important ideas underlying this sort of pacifism is love, especially the disinterested brotherly love that is described in the Greek New Testament using the word agape. King explains it this way, quote, "In the final analysis, agape means recognition of the fact that all life is interrelated, all humanity is involved in a single process, and all men are brothers. To the degree that I harm my brother, no matter what he is doing to me, to that extent I am harming myself." Unquote. This idea represents the extension of Christian pacifism in light of Gandhian principles. Further discussions should more systematically consider how such ideas have spread to Latin America, East Asia, and the Muslim world, as well as the ways that nonviolence shows up in the religious and philosophical traditions of the rest of the world. Research projects in pacifism and peace studies should continue to explore ideas found in the variety of world traditions, including Taoism, African thought, and indigenous American philosophies. Section 6 will be next time, Objections to Pacifism and Possible Replies. Oh dear, as I said before about this section, I don't really want to hear objections to pacifism, which is why I gotta read them, because you can't just do what you want in philosophy. That's not how the truth works. That's preference, which is not the same as truth. We're going to do another video today. I'm going to do an experiment, so stay tuned.